Finally, I found music. Hopefully, it isn't copyrighted. If it is, that sucks. But on a different note, apologies for being absent for way too long. I kind of forgot, to be fully honest, but at least now I can resume. Let me see where we were last time. Chapter 12. So, Chapter 15 is next. Alright, without further ado, let's start this. Damn. There we go. Chapter 12. Most of the prisoners at Holzemind had no intention of burrowing a tunnel or concocting an elaborate breakout scheme. They filled their hours in other ways, taking advantage of the small liberties that Neymar allowed them. Some of them checked books out from the bustling library. Its diligent attendant had collected more than 5,000 volumes. Others joined study circles to discuss architecture or the evolution of man. Some took classes taught by other prisoners practiced in farming, construction, engineering, bookkeeping, horse management, and town planning, as well as French, Russian, German, and even Portuguese. There were hockey teams knocking about a half-sized oblong ice pond, apologies, formed on the Spitzplatz. Officers threw one another in a jiu-jitsu class. Bridge and poker sessions ran around the clock. Other often fueled by too much wine, and there was even a knitting circle. 7 prisoners became amateur painters and sketch artists. They also formed an orchestra. There was a man who seemed to be able to play anything, one orchestra member said. He taught me the double bass and trombone. The orchestra kept me going. It kept our spirits up. It would have been terrible if we had to mooch about all day long. The orchestra accompanied the upstart Gaiety Theater, which Neymar finally permitted. Perhaps part of it because it gave guards free entertainment. A rotating cast of prisoners turned actors from the British Amateur Dramatic Society put on a variety of shows and plays in the dining hall, pushing together the tables to make a stage. Besides actors, the theater occupied a small army of prisoners who become stagehands, set designers, costume makers, and directors. James Whale, who would later become famous for his early Hollywood films Frankenstein and The Invisible Man, got his start in drama at Holzemind. Pots of paint, wigs, flats, and all the other properties in true bohemian confusion, he wrote. And yet, on show nights, they jumped together like magic. There were a multitude of characters in Holzemind from all over the British Empire. One captor described a motley crew: Australians, South Africans, Canadians, New Zealanders, Irish, Scot, English, and Welsh. Every branch of the armed services were there too. Pilots, cavalrymen, infantry, engineers, sappers, and garrison gunners. They all came in all categories of personality. The intellectuals regarded with disdain the fidgety scandalmongers. The foxtrot outfit squabbles with the churchgoers, both requiring the same room at the same time for their widely different purposes. Then there are the drunks and the blue-ribbon army, the studious and the do-notters, the nightbirds and the gamesters. The arrival in December 1917 of Harold Mellicott bolstered the mood throughout the camp. For breakout artists and those not interested alike, Mellicott was Britain's answer to Harry Houdini, and had almost a dozen breakouts under his belt, several in broad daylight. One time he slid down the outside of a castle tower, his cell at the very top so high that the Germans did not believe it needed bars. Another time he rigged a plank of wood straight out of the second-floor window to cross a deep moat surrounding an old prison fortress. The officers believed that anybody could escape from Holzemind and shape Neymar. Mellicott was the man. A legend even German guards. He had broken out of 9 camps already, never using the same method twice. With his usual bluster, Neymar threw Mellicott that Holzemind was escape-proof, a declaration that guaranteed success would be all the sweeter for the whole camp. On Sunday, February 10th, Mellicott and his prisoner, Captain Joseph Waller, were all set to go. Their planned time to the second. At 3:30 p.m., wearing old Burberry jackets, rucksacks looped over their shoulders, they emerged from Block B. All was normal in the camp. Officers warmed their hands around the cookhouse stoves. Some strolled around the Spitzplatz. Patrolling guards paced the grounds. Nobody paid the two any mind. In broad daylight, they made a hard turn and crossed the gap between the two barrack blocks. Without hesitation, they lifted the single strand of wire that marked no man's land. At the barbed wire fence, a few feet beyond, they bent down and quickly cut a hole. The orderly Dick Cash had provided the needed wire cutters. He traded food with a German workman for them. Prisoners spied the brazen move from the windows of both barrack blocks. At first, they could not quite comprehend what they were seeing. Two sentries were walking a beat in the no man's land behind each barracks block. Surely they would notice the two prisoners. Then they realized the guards were walking away from each other, headed to the western and eastern end of the barrack block, their backs to the two escapees. Once the guards reached the end of the blocks, however, they would turn around and come back. They heard anything and turned early, Medlicott and Walter would be lost. Still, Medlicott and Walter continued. They were now at the northern wall. Medlicott hoisted his partner up on his shoulders, and Walter snipped a hole in the barbed wire palisade. As soon as the hole was complete, he passed the wire cutters down to Medlicott, pushed through his rucksack, and crawled through the hole after it. Still, there was no whistle of alarm. Medlicott threw the wire cutters back across no man's land for Cash to retrieve. There, just as the two guards made the reverse turn, he scaled the wall like a spider and drove the hole in the palisade. The sentries beyond the wall had been out of sight as well, since again there was no shout of alarm. Outside, they stood calmly by the wall, unfolded gently Homburg hats from inside their jackets, lit cigarettes, and strolled down the road like two villagers out for a Sunday afternoon stroll. Medlicott and Walter would have made it away except that a sharp-eyed German guard watching over the isolation cells in Block B had, through a small, high window, seen them mount the wall. By the time he ran up the steps into the yard, the two breakout had already turned off the road and were heading towards some woods half a mile away. They were still within sight of the camp when the alarm was raised. At first they kept to a fast walk, hoping they might yet be mistaken for civilians. When guards poured out of the main gate and headed in their direction, they quickened into a jog. Soldiers from a nearby garrison, alerted by telephone by Neymar, cut them off before they reached the woods. Neymar met them in the yard, flushed with pride. He clapped his hands to escapee's chest and declared, "All my boys come back to me." When the officers standing in the window would not be quiet, Neymar ordered his guards to fire at the barracks. Nobody was hit, but crashing glass forced everyone to back away. Medlicott and Walter were brought down into the cellars and were not seen again at Holzheim before being sent away. At next roll call, puffed with pride at the capture of the great Harold Medlicott, Neymar boasted about his unblemished record of there had been no successful home runs to Holland. But if he thought that the foiled attempt had crushed the morale of any who dared to be next, he was wrong. As one prisoner wrote to Medlicott's family, the staggering brave display only proved to them all that it was impossible for the Germans to confine a determined man. That is true. In late February 1918, the tunnel plot ran into trouble again. The sap was some 25 yards long when men began to run into roots and flat rocks embedded in the hard clay. Progress slowed, and the men emerged after their ships with cuts to their hands and covered with bruises from bumping their arms, legs, and hands against the stones. They believed they must have run into an ancient riverbed. At the same time, their team was falling apart. Since the Boxing Day announcement about prisoners being transferred to internment in Holland, similar declarations came almost weekly. Often these were contradicted the very next day. Names dropped, dates postponed. Mosley, Rogers, Ellis, Cochrane, and a handful of other original tunnelers received word to pack their bags. Rather than welcoming the news, they were devastated. They had spent their time in captivity, risking death, suffering, solitary confinement, and exhausting themselves, all with an eye on escape. They saw the transfer as failure, especially since, under the terms of the agreement between the Germans and the Allies, released soldiers were forbidden to return to the battlefield. Further, although they would be free from Neymar and the trials of Holzheim, they would be leaving their friends behind in Germany. As Cochrane said, "I felt like a deserter, nothing more or less." Given the choice, he would have gladly traded his spot for someone else. At the end of February, Gray said his goodbyes to Cochrane and the Pink Toes. They had left the sap in his hands. And so he became the father of the tunnel. Only Kennard and Frederick Murdoch of the Royal Navy Air Service, RNAS, remained from the original team. Now Gray needed not only to figure out how to burrow through the layers of rock, but also assemble a whole new band of tunnelers while he was at it. thanks to Hajnik sending the most die-hard escape artists to Holzemind, he had a long list from which to choose. In March, a new prisoner arrived with the boldness and experience they needed, Cecil Blaine. He had spent over 2 months digging a tunnel in Neuenkirchen, another prison camp. After it was discovered, he had vowed to never tunnel again. He quickly broke his vow to be with Kennard and Gray, working together, again at long last. They were happy to have him. Blaine called the dirt to drag himself forward. Ever so often, a rat scurried across his back or stared him straight in the eye. Worms and other unseen creepy crawlies squirmed through his hair and underneath his work outfit, which stuck to him like a milkweed second skin. In the air, there was never enough to fill his lungs as he forged his way around the sandstone wall that had slowed and diverted the sap for weeks. As he advanced, he made sure to limit the swings of his elbows and kicks of his feet. The rise of his back, one indiscreet move in an unlucky spot in the walls or roof might give out under the weight of the earth above. There would be no warning, no thunderous boom to announce the cave-in. The dirt would simply cover him like a heavy shroud, immobilizing his body with its terrible weight and snuffing out his breath before he could cry out for help. At last, he arrived at the tunnel face. Slowly, but with a certain rhythm, he hacked with a chisel at the wall ahead, scraped away the loose chunks with a trowel, and filled the bowl with the excavated earth using a small handbrake. Part of him enjoyed it. The danger, the toil, the teamwork. It was all an adventure and a better way to spend his days than sitting in the barracks. As long as the candle wedged in the wall by his side continued to flicker and dance, if the flame ever dulled into a faint red, he was in trouble. Back by the tunnel's entrance, Gray was keeping the candle and Blaine alive. Crouched in a small cave carved into an early left turn in a sap, he operated what might have been best described as a bellows. As the tunnel lengthened past the sandstone wall, the diggers found that they were growing faint from the lack of oxygen. A few went delirious and had been dragged out by their feet. Some method to supply fresh air was needed. Someone dreamed up a bellows made from wooden planks and a leather RFC jacket set on a vertical stand. To pipe air into the tunnel face, they collected round shaving tins, knocked out the ends, strung them together, and covered them with canvas. Links were added as needed. Being the plumper was monstrous, arduous work. Being the pumper was monotonous, arduous work. Kennard stood just a few feet away, inside the chamber underneath the stairs, holding a rope in his hand and waiting to feel the tug. He was responsible for hauling back the bowl of dirt and stone when Blaine was ready to send it back. He emptied the contents into cloth sacks and stacked them in a steadily shrinking space underneath the stairs. On a good, well-run shift, the diggers would have another pile to put in the bowl by the time the pack was ready to have them pull it back. During their 4-hour shift, Blaine, Gray, and Kennard rotated through the jobs. Being the digger for too long was simply not sustainable, particularly for the claustrophobe Kennard, who had to bend every shred of his will to maintain his calm. The exertion, the foul air, the press of earth in every direction, the threat of collapse all took their toll. To exit the tunnel, the digger had to snake backward, feet first, inch by inch, through the tunnel to be free of it. There was simply no space to turn around. At 3:45 p.m., the shift was over. The 3 men shed their grungy work outfits, wiped their skin clean of dirt with cloth, and dressed in their orderly uniforms. Now they had sneaked back to their quarters. At this late afternoon hour, guards often used the stairs, bringing supplies up and down from the cellars. Though the thin breaks in the plank wall, the tunnelers could see them pass. Eventually, an orderly rapped on the secret door and whispered, "Come out now." The 3 men unlatched the side bolt and stepped out through the plank door. At first the light stung their eyes, then they hurried up the steps and the orderly returned the bolt into place. At the exit, they waited for one of their lookouts to give them another all clear. With a single word, "right," the 3 moved out, forcing themselves to not so much glance at the guard opposite the door. If you got a look at their faces, you might recognize one of them. They tried not to walk too fast or too slow, relying on others from their team to intercept and distract any Germans who might cross their path. At last, they were back in room 24, where they had quickly changed back into their officer uniforms, famished and exhausted, and suffering stabbing headaches from the terrible air. Chapter 13. Whether walking in the yard, sitting in their rooms, or working their shifts, the tunnelers continually hashed out how once through the sap they would make it across the 150 miles to the border. In fact, the distance they would have to travel as fugitives would be far greater than the detours needed to avoid towns and major roads. Gray was particularly aware that most escapes fell apart in this phase. Day and night, he considered different plans, searching for something foolproof. Most of the tunnelers were banding up in teams for the flight to Holland, and Gray was committed to go with Blaine and Kennard. He would not do a solitary run again. His own from Crayfield had proved to him how important it was to have partners who would look out for one another. There were few braver, tough, and more cool-headed when it mattered than Blaine and Kennard. Travel by train Gray discounted, chiefly because a mass breakout would result in Namor dispatching police to every nearby station and alerting conductors to confront any suspicious passengers. This left a journey by foot. Moving at night and hiding out during the day limited their chances of discovery, but Gray also knew that there would be almost no way to cover such a distance without being spotted and forced into some kind of interaction. They would need disguises and cover stories. Gray spoke German fluently, but Blaine and Kennard would have far more trouble. Blaine had Cape Dutch from his time in South Africa. He could make an attempt by answering some simple questions, but Kennard was unable to manage more than a few prepared phrases. Knowing this, Gray considered a plan where he would act as an officer, escorting a pair of privates. Given his rank, he would be expected to answer for them. However, if challenged to any degree by a higher official, Blaine and Kennard might be required to speak. They would be in trouble. Further, their uniforms would never remain sufficiently clean enough to pass military inspection after they tramped through the woods and slept outdoors. No, Gray decided to need a plan to convince any doubters. Something extraordinary. There was a lot to do in preparations. They needed good maps and compasses, as well as food for 15 days of travel, and Tommy cookers to heat their meals. They needed warm clothes and tough boots. They needed waterproof sacks to get their belongings across the River Wester. There were documents to forge, clothes to tailor, photographs to take. In unoccupied room 83, the tunnelers assembled a vertical escape factory, or as they called it, a temple to the goddess of flight. They hid items under floorboards and behind sliding paneled walls, along with all manner of equipment used in their preparations, including locksmithing and woodworking tools, sewing machine and dyes, inks and paper for passes. They had built their tunnel bellows in this room. During mid-April, they were hard at work making passes and creating backpacks from old jackets smeared with lard. In all these efforts, they had help. Since their first arriving in Holzenmine, officers had arrived and enveloped some of the guards and other staff, turning them into willing accomplices who provided information or special items. Namor's poor treatment of his men made them easy turncoats. As one British officer described, when the commandant, tired of abusing his prisoners, he vented his black gusts of bilious passion on his staff, often leaving them literally trembling as he flayed them with his tongue. The war's harsh economic rationing was added motivation. Letter boy, the commandant's clerk, was easily charmed with coffee and cookies. His work delivering letters gave him free rein to move about the barracks. He met almost daily with the conspirators to pass along the latest intelligence or materials he purchased on their behalf. What was more, he always knew when searches were coming and whether any would occur. The sanitary man was the only civilian at Holzenmine who could go about without a guard accompanying him. In exchange for some cash and something from Fornham and Mason, the upmarket London grocery store, he would shop in town for any goods the prisoners requested. The typist, a young secretary and commandant, helped them for less mercenary reasons. She had fallen in love with Peter Loyne, a 6'3" Australian infantry officer who was a member of the Tunnel Conspiracy. Since his capture in spring of 1917, Loyne had lost over 60 pounds because of insufficient diet, but none of his good looks. Between exchanging love notes, the typist provided sample passes and paper stock on which they were printed. Finally, there was Kurt Guru, a well-meaning camp interpreter. He had been stationed in India and once proclaimed, "I do not care for Germany, I do not care for England, my heart is in India." As Gray had served as a member of years in the army there, not to mention it was his birthplace. He was able to convince Garu that he could help him set up in India when the war was over. Garu became friend due to their cause. The tunnelers benefited well from the continued Allied effort, with several orderlies. Beyond providing access to the quarters, these men also helped with the escape factory. With his photographic experience, Dick Cash was foremost among them. Not only did the officers need photographs for their passes, they needed a copy of a map for their journey. It was one thing to identify every village, road, waterway, and town they came across. The ability to do so might separate success from capture. They had managed to smuggle into Holzheim a large military map that covered the expanse of territory they would need to cross. Cash made a shopping list, camera, plates, chemicals, printer paper, and a cardboard bike lamp to develop the film. He started collecting what he needed. Each week, Gray asked for additional copies of the map. Because of the sap lengthened, the number of officers brought into the fold increased. Protocol required that Lieutenant Colonel Rathborne, a senior British officer after Wingland, would be sent to another camp, be informed of the plan. What was more, he could use his position to stall other attempts that might result in their tunnel's discovery. Gray knew that Rathborne was keen to escape himself. When notified, Rathborne not only gave his blessing, but volunteered to join the scheme, and to help in any way he could. Others were brought in to stand lookout as well, to obtain boards to brace the tunnel walls, sacks to pack dirt into, and tins to extend the ventilation pipe. With each additional member, the chance of exposure grew, but Gray accepted the risk. There was no way to build a tunnel of that length and orchestrate a well-prepared, properly supplied home run to the Holland. One afternoon, Gray finally struck upon an idea of his own escape run with Blaine and Kennard. He was in the tunnel chamber with two of them, and they were getting ready to start their shift. Kennard lit a candle and knelt down by the sap entrance. Looking into the dark hole, he muttered, "We must be bloody mad." "That's it!" Gray exclaimed. Blaine and Kennard looked at their usually detective friend as if he had suddenly lost the run of himself. "Mad!" Gray chuckled. "Mad! That's the answer. It simply couldn't miss." The other two tried to get him to explain, but he told them that he wanted to think of it some more, to investigate its faults and merits. "Come on, let's get on with it," he said, taking the candle from Kennard. "I think I've come up with the answers to our prayers, that's all." With that, he crawled into the tunnel, the first digger of the day. Then a run of bad luck and imprudence puts everything in jeopardy. First rumors of the scheme began to filter through the camp, with roughly 2 dozen individuals in the know, as well as the strange movements of officers in and out of their quarters. Keeping their activity secret was impossible, but it was one thing to hear a rumor and quite another to know exactly where the tunnel is located. An orderly known to spy for Neymar in exchange for gifts of wine began asking around camp about where the tunnel's entrance was hidden. It was too great a risk for the tunnelers, and one night, while drunk, the orderly accidentally tumbled down the steps in Block B and cracked his skull. He never made another inquiry. In mid-May, Neymar instituted reprisals to the response and restrictions put in place against German officers in Britain. Worst of these, for the tunnelers, was the new schedule of roll calls. Instead of twice a day at 9 a.m. and 4 p.m., prisoners were now forced to gather at the Speech Plaza at 9 a.m., 11:30 a.m., 3:30 p.m., and 6 p.m. These frequent roll calls cut straight into the middle of the 4-hour tunnel shifts. At first, the tunnelers tried standing in for those on shift. When the names of the working crew were called, their mates answered for them, and then moved down the line to respond to their own names. They pulled it off for a few days, but were sure that continuing the charade, day after day, would see them caught. They began to rush to and from the digging sessions between the 11:30 and 3:30 roll calls. The time of the day when most guards were away from Block B for lunch. Roll calls took at least half an hour, which meant that even hurrying, the teams of 3 had less than 2 hours underground. Their recklessness quickly cost them. One day after finishing a shift, a working party was hurried out of the east door of Block B without taking the usual precautions, and one of the officers was recognized by a passing guard. The guard tried to stop the officer, but he rushed away into the barracks through his own entrance. Neymar was informed of the incident, and a search of Block B followed, but the guard could not identify the officer in question. All the prisoners were ordered onto the Speech Plaza, and the exhaustive inspection of the orderlies barracks began. The tunnelers waited for the fateful moment when their secret door would be found. After a long time, the prisoners were ordered back into the barracks. Yet again, the door had eluded discovery. The tunnelers breathed easy at last. Upset that nothing had been found, Neymar vented his spleen on the guard who had failed to identify the officer, sending him to the jug for 8 days. He also posted a permanent guard on the steps outside the orderly's door. With this, the tunnelers lost their access point. It was a cruel blow. They immediately decided to stop all activity. The Germans were on alert, and anything out of the ordinary was sure to raise suspicion. During this time, horrible news reached them via the Podlu. Harold Melcott and Joseph Wallace had been murdered. Having escaped from Bad Goldberg camp in Saxony, some 150 miles south of Holzheim, they had been caught on the run. The camp's commandant, a man named Kroner, had sent 8 of his most fearsome men to get them at the local train station. Before leaving, one of them had overheard saying, "Yes, they are 2 very brave men, but they will be shot." Later this afternoon, the guards returned to the camp with 2 stretchers covered in dark sheets, clearly the dead bodies of Melicott and Walker. According to Kroner, they had been shot in the Pelthwood forest after a sudden dash for freedom from the station. The senior British officer at Bad Goldberg demanded to see the bodies that had been killed in the manner reported. The nature of their wounds would match the story. Kroner refused. Then, while several British officers distracted guards watching over the bodies, another officer rushed up and threw aside the sheets. Melicott and Walter's bodies were riddled with over a dozen bullets and stabbed with several bayonet wounds. It was evident they had been murdered. Kroner's story was a patent lie. The tunnelers in Holzheim had little doubt that they would risk the same fate if they too were caught escaping. Neymar had proven himself time and time again to use force, either by bayonet or bullet, to make a statement. But the prisoners were undaunted. They surveyed the barracks and the grounds again, looking for another way down to their sap. Nobody lived in the attic of the officer section in Block B, and as a result, the Germans were unlikely to inspect any room too closely. The double swinging doors on the floor were secured by a metal chain looped between 2 steel handles and a heavy padlock. Picking the padlock would be too time-consuming, but the handles themselves would only fasten the door by 6 screws. Remove the screws, take off one handle, and they could access the floor. Afterward, replace the screw and handle, and nobody would be the wiser. There was a barricade separating their quarters from those of the orderlies, but they found a way to bypass it. The eaves. These ran the length of the barracks, like a corridor under the heavily sloped roof. If they cut a panel in the roof in one room, they could use the eaves to reach the eastern side. This they did quickly, making an opening look seamless at the wall by using some mortar and distemper paint, hiding it behind an unused bed. Then they discovered a small door at the end of the eaves that opened into the attic room, where some of the orderlies slept. No doubt the original builders put it there to access the space. Not only did this solution return access to their tunnels in the cellar, it was a far superior approach. They would no longer risk masquerading as orderlies to get past the guards. More important, apart from showing up as for roll calls, they could dig day and night. So they resumed work, making up for lost time. Sadly, I'm going to have to end this episode here. 1, because my computer is nearly dead. Actually, that's the only reason. So, I promise I'll read more when it comes to it. Thank you all, and hopefully this is good.